very much for having me tonight. And my presentation is going to build on the excellent points made already. But what I really wanted to focus on, and secret signal, next slide please, is moving from a program-by-program approach or agency-level response to a systems response to youth homelessness. And I'm glad we have a member of the Provincial Assembly here with us tonight, because a lot of the pathways into homelessness and the ramifications of homelessness that we have already been discussing, they have roots in our public policy and in our public systems like corrections, health, child intervention, etc. So it's about the response that we create at that level and how it articulates with the emergency responses and the really big frontline work that's happening once youth already become homeless. And that's the work that I'm really involved in at the national level through the Homeless Partnering Strategy. And it's designing system responses across communities in Canada. And Calgary's one example of that type of work, but Jeanette and I do work in rural communities as well, and the experience is always somewhat contextualized, and understanding the macroeconomic forces, how public systems intersect at the local level, all that's really crucial to understanding how we ultimately end youth homelessness. So next slide, please. The other piece that I wanted to touch on today was basic numbers and figures for you. You've heard about the experience of youth and the individual faces and stories already, but sometimes painting the picture with numbers gives you a sense of the magnitude and prevalence of the issue, and it gives you a sense of the use of research and practice as well, and the use of research and public policy, because it's, again, the research and action that helps move public policy oftentimes. And that's one of the great experiences that I had out of the University of Calgary, and they're not paying me to say that, but it's really about taking research and making it make sense for policymakers, for frontline staff, and for system planners with respect to a particular issue. So I will give you a sense of the magnitude of youth homelessness in Calgary, at least from what we know with the most recent research and figures. And I also wanted to touch base with you on some of the progress being made from a system perspective in Calgary as well. And if there's time and interest, we can discuss what's happening internationally and across Canada as well. Next slide, please. So, we skipped the slide, but that's okay. I can take it from here. The previous slide is just a note on definitions, and my point around that is that definitions are, again, very crucial when we talk about social issues and how we frame, how we discuss an issue. Saying the 24-year age in particular is something I wanted to pick up on from what the other speakers said. And youth don't mature at a 16 or 18. It's hard to put a particular numeric figure on saying that this person is now independent. And when we looked at research on youth homelessness, we saw that often systems failed to recognize that transition to independence is not a hard break, right? So a lot of public supports and a lot of agency and frontline supports put this fake limit to when support ends for a particular individual. So I wanted to really emphasize that in our definition of youth homelessness, it's extending that definition to as long as the youth needs that support. And that can be 24, 25 years. The importance of that is that in our current public system, youth stop getting supports at 18. Some of them can get some supports up to 24, but again, without having a recognition of the need to change definitions in legislation, we're only going to be partially successful. So that's what the slide was that we missed. With respect to youth homelessness in Calgary, it was mentioned that 2,000 youth every year experience homelessness. That came from a study I did back in 2009 with the youth sector in Calgary. And as good as our estimates are, they're really just estimates. When we did a homeless count at different intervals in Calgary, 21% of those enumerated are youth, so and that's up to the age of 24. And in 2012, there was 721 young people and those up to 24 and younger that were homeless in our city. And the importance of that is that it's only a point-in-time count, so it just represents one night in our city. The 2000 was an attempt to calculate the magnitude throughout an entire year for how many people experience homelessness during that period. The importance of a point-in-time count cannot be underestimated, however. Currently in Canada, there is no national homeless count, so we don't really know what numbers we're talking about, and as much as you don't want to reduce people to numbers, and that's not the point, to make arguments for policy change, to make arguments for more affordable housing, you need to have numbers to make business cases, and you need to make numbers to put some context around what a community is experiencing. So one of the initiatives I'm also involved in with the Canadian Homelessness Research Network and the federal government through the Homelessness Partnering Strategy is to create a national homeless count across Canada, so that on a particular night, every community would go out and enumerate homeless individuals. And that would again give us a sense of baseline over time. It would help us monitor trends, including whether the proportion of the homeless who are youth is growing or shifting in any manner. And currently, we don't have that information. So it's really tough to create systems to respond to something that you don't really have a good grasp on. The best figures we have, like I said, are the 721. But again, those can easily be argued against because they really are just a point in time. And one of the initiatives that I was part of when I was at the Calgary Homeless Foundation was to create an information system that looked at trends throughout the year and follow people as they move through the system to get a better sense of what their needs would be. Unfortunately, that's just in its infancy. So there's going to be a long time before we actually have some of the critical information necessary to make the system work. And that's why public policy advocacy can't necessarily wait for the research. We have to keep going based on the information that we have. Some of the information that we have is actually very powerful. So in a study that was conducted from the University of Calgary, Social Work, and I think actually you were involved in this study with Catherine and Bruce, they revealed some astonishing statistics, and there's no need to wait. I mean, this paints the urgency of the issue. You heard about some of the pathways into homelessness that were already mentioned, but listen to some of these stats on street homeless youth. So about 43% reported childhood mental illness diagnosis. 75% reported being the victim of violence. In terms of substance abuse, 94%. Engagement in survival or obligatory sex, 20% of male and 33% of females. So again, abuse, family disruption, involvement with criminal justice systems and child intervention services, and of course, poor educational outcomes, not surprisingly. These are all common factors that not only show up in the individual stories that we hear, but they show up on a population basis as well among this youth. So what is it about this population that makes them more vulnerable to homelessness? Again, the developmental stage of youth, they cannot be assumed to be the same as adults. We can't expect youth to get a job and get off the streets. Right? They're 12 years old, they're 13, 14. That's just not a reality. Youth also face discrimination in the housing market. Landlords are not going to rent to a 16-year-old. I'm pretty sure 16-year-olds can't even hold a lease legally. So that, again, this complicates their pathways out of homelessness as well. The gaps in social services that I mentioned before, while youth may be perfect candidates to get access to income assistance so they can go to school, get access to housing, etc., some of them are not eligible for that assistance. Those that are very vulnerable and are involved with the child intervention or correctional system already, because of the backgrounds that were already mentioned around abuse, etc., The lack of discharge planning out of those systems gets people in vulnerable situations, and they end up in the cycle of homelessness as well. So all these pieces that I'm mentioning around poverty, lack of affordable housing, the disconnect between the needs of youth and the public systems that are designed to serve them, all these are public policy issues, and so they require a systems response rather than an individual response. And those, of course, have to be complementary and aligned, but we can't forget about that higher order of work that needs to happen, and the advocacy that we need to do as community members with our politicians and administrators within our systems as well. Next slide, please. This is just a pie chart showing you the statistics and age distribution of the homeless population in Calgary, and highlights the age ranges as well. And I'm going to make this available to you guys, the presentation, if you want to get a sense of the numbers in more detail as well. Ending homelessness. That's the next slide, please. So what is it going to take to end youth homelessness in our city? The good news is that we do have a plan to end homelessness in Calgary, and there is actually a youth plan as well. There's a youth sector, so that's a group of agencies as well as public system partners that have worked together towards implementing the youth plan to end homelessness. We also have news that there's a provincial plan in the works that is meant to address youth homelessness at that level. We haven't heard about its release yet, but we know it's in the works, and we know it is aligned with the priorities that the community had set out to achieve in the plan. That inclusive definition of homeless youth, so not serving the aims of legislation or the aims of programs or the aims of public systems. It's about wrapping the supports around the youth based on their needs, so it's client-driven and rather than system or program-driven supports. Enhancement of access to services within child intervention services. We have a wonderful act in place, that the Child and Youth Enhancement Act, that gives youth access to financial case management support, etc., to address some of their housing stability issues, etc. But many of the youth that fall through the gaps don't actually end up having access to that, some of those supports, because of issues in the definition of youth that I mentioned before. And then developing and implementing appropriate interventions around housing and supports. I think you guys have heard of the term Housing First already tonight, or it was briefly mentioned. Housing First essentially means that you're rapidly rehousing somebody who is homeless, and you're providing wraparound supports to ensure their housing stability long term. Housing First has been very successful with some populations, particularly chronically homeless adults with mental health and addiction issues. But there's also been some experimentation for how to adapt that model to youth as well. And it's not a straight across cut and paste by any means, but there are experts who have been able to adopt that model, and Boys and Girls Club Infinity Project, for example, is a Housing First project that targets homeless youth with fantastic results. So having those types of initiatives in place that are well-funded and aligned with Housing First principles, so that youth are met with non-judgmental approaches to youth management, that youth are involved in their housing process, etc. That's really key to ensuring that the system is actually responding to their needs.